It was the summer before my senior year in college, and I was getting ready to head back to school. And I'd been living in a fraternity the prior 2 years, so I was moving into an off-campus house with one of my fraternity brothers. First time living in an apartment, and I was kind of getting ready and buying some furniture or whatever that I needed for the house. And one of the things I needed was a desk. So I went to a tag sale, and it was in kind of a rough area. This was in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But I found this beautiful, big oak desk. It was in pretty good condition. And I got it for real cheap. It was like, I don't know, like $20 or something. So I had my dad's pickup truck. I had my friend John with me. We put it in the pickup truck. And then a couple of weeks later, when I was heading back to school, my mom and dad took me up with all my stuff, including the desk. And we got to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I was going to school at Lehigh. So, as we, kind of moved the desk up the stairs to the front door, you could see like the desk, it was just a little tiny bit. It looked a little tiny bit too big, like it was not going to get in. But it was close. It was so close. So my dad took the front door off. And I remember my dad picked up one side of the desk. My mom picked up the other. I was in the inside. My mom was facing me. And they tried to get that desk in the front door. And it was just so tight, and my memory was of looking at my mom's face, and her teeth were just grinding, and she had that look like she was going to get that door, that desk in that door no matter what. And she just pushed and struggled and pushed, and it just kind of like scraped through the front door. Probably did a little bit of damage. Thankfully, my landlord never complained about it, but we got it in. And then, my dad put the door back on. But, the point is, I'll never forget that look on her face, that look of determination, like she was not going to like go home without getting that desk in the house one way or another. She was not going to let her little baby be disappointed because he didn't have the desk for his school year. And, and I think to myself, my parents made so many sacrifices for us kids. Like we didn't have a lot of money. Their whole life, while we were growing up was kind of the story about just selfless sacrifice for the children. But it's funny how you just remember these little flashes, these little moments, like that event, like the look on my mom's face and the determination she had. And that's one of the things that just stick in my mind when I think about my mother. Or another example, like my dad. My dad was just a fun guy. He loved his children. And, there were days when, and by the way, he worked 2 jobs. He worked at night as a printer, and during the day he picked up whatever work he can to make some extra money. But when, like on Saturdays, when my mom that was the time she got to run all her errands. So we were home with my dad. When she would go out the door, my dad would say like, "Okay, kids, mom's gone. Like time for the party." And, he'd get a tray from the kitchen and, he'd give us he'd fill glasses of ginger ale and a bowl of potato chips and some cookies or something. And we'd go in, it was like, party, and he would play music and we would all dance and bounce off the walls. And I think this was like the 60s. So, we'd do the twist. He's like, "Come on, Spence, do the twist," and we just adored my father. And again, it's like those, the party, he'd throw a party when my mom left the house. Like that just sticks out in my mind about just one of the best times growing up. We just adored him. Like when he would go to work in the afternoon, he would probably leave around 3:30 to be at work at 4. We didn't want him to go, so we were like little kids. So we would just like grab his legs and hold on to his clothes, and he would just like drag us to the front door. And we were just like, no. And my mom would be like, "Kids, stop! Like your dad, he's got to get to work. He's going to be late. They're going to fire him." And I thought that meant that they were going to throw my dad in a fire if he was late for work. And I would say to my sister, like, "Get off, they're going to fire Dad." And she's like, "I don't care. I hope they do fire him." And I was like, wow, man, she's callous. But again, it was like, those memories of just adoring my dad so much. Again, it's like one of those flashes, it's like a picture you have in your head. And that's what stays with you. So I got to say, when my wife and I, my wife Catherine and I had kids, we had our twins kind of late in life, I kind of knew that those were going to be the best years. I knew that, and I did not take them for granted. We had those twins. I just remember thinking like, all the stuff I did outside of work, with my spare time, I just checked that at the door. I have always had a busy job, so every minute I had that I wasn't working, I really devoted to my kids, because I knew that was going to be like the best way I can spend my time. I would enjoy it the most, and I really did. I think it's in Psalm 127. It says, children are a gift and a reward from the Lord, and that's how I really thought about them. And again, it was kind of the same thing, about how I think about my own parents. I think it's funny what my kids remember from their childhood that they bring up, things that I wouldn't expect. Again, it's kind of like those little moments. I was talking to my son not too long ago, and he said, "Dad, what was like the coolest night?" I was like, "No." He said that last night we spent at Yaya and Papu's house, and I knew exactly what he was talking about. I remember it very well. So Yaya and Papu means grandpa and grandma. Well, Yaya is grandmother, grandpa is Papu is grandfather. So it was. My father at that point was in a nursing home. My mom had passed, and my brother and sister and I were selling the house that we grew up in. We had cleaned it out, completely cleaned it out. We sold it, and that it was I think it was like a Saturday was going to be the closing. So I went. I was going to be the one who did all the papers and gave the checks and all that. And I took Christopher with me to Connecticut. So he and I, we went to Connecticut, like on a Friday. We had dinner, we went to the mall, and I knew that when we got back to the house, and we were going to sleep at the house that night, the only thing left in the house was some of the furniture from the room that my brother and I slept in, the twin beds and maybe a bureau. But there was no TV, there was nothing, in the house. So I thought like it's going to be kind of boring when we get back there. So we went to the mall. And I said to Christopher, like, let's go to the candy store and let's buy whatever candy we want. Now I was kind of an uptight, I guess to say helicopter father. I was not loose, in terms of the rules with the kids, and that includes what they ate, their nutrition and candy. Once in a while we'd go to the drugstore and get like a candy bar or something, but there was a limit there. But this night I just thought like, let's just fill our bags with candy. And it was the good candy. It wasn't like the kind of candy you get at the grocery store, at the drugstore. It was the mall candy. And he was like, really? As much as I want? I'm like, yeah, just get whatever you want. And I filled my bag, and we went back to the house, and we just sat on the bed that was my bed in our bedroom. And Christopher and I just gorged ourselves with candy, played cards for it was hours, and just talked. In the house I grew up in, the last night we were going to be there, in the bedroom that my brother and I were in. And I think he kind of understood the significance of that. It just made it so special. But again, it was one of those scenarios you couldn't plan. It just turned out cool. And I think part of it was the fact that I let Christopher just eat as much candy as he wanted, and I joined with him. I ate a ton of candy. I guess there was some instinct I had that said, that's going to be okay, this one time. It's just going to add something to the evening, and it did. I guess the point of all this is, I feel like in my life, when I look back, there's certain things I would have done differently. Now, I don't spend a lot of time, regretting things I had done. You kind of learn by your mistakes. But one of the things I'm so grateful that I figured out, I feel like I have no regrets about, and that is that I just devoted, my time and attention to my kids. There were times when I would literally have to get up at work at 4 a.m, just ahead of time, just to crank some work out, because I knew, in the afternoon I wanted to go to the kids' soccer game. And even on the weekends, I just always made time for my kids. I don't regret that at all. So if you're a new parent, I would say, work is important, but put it in perspective. I got to say, there was a point, in my life, when the kids were probably around maybe 5 or 6 years old. The company I'd worked for got bought out. and I was out of work for a year, and things got really, really desperate financially. I mean, we spent every last penny to buy the house that we're in now, and then within a year, I was laid off and out of work. So we were down, at that point, at the end of that year, like really down to nothing, and maybe this wasn't the right thing for me to do, but I remember, laying in bed with my son. We were saying our evening prayers, and I said, Christopher, I said, and I don't know how the subject of money came up, and I think my kids knew that we were struggling. They just pick up on that. And he asked about it, and I said, yeah. I said things are really rough. But if we had to sell the house, and even if we had to live in a little box on the side of the road, we'd be okay, wouldn't we? And he was like, yeah, Dad, we'd be okay. Of course we'd be okay, but would we really have to live in a box? And I was like, he said something like, well, couldn't we just live in a really little house? And I said, yeah, I think we could live in a little house. And, I think if like a child psychologist heard that conversation, they would have said to me, like, that was not okay. Like, that's not good for your child. You don't throw that burden of financial, desperation onto your kids. And I would agree with that. But in that moment, I just felt like I just didn't want to pull the wool over my kids' eyes, and make them think otherwise, and get them prepared in case we had to sell the house. Because I really thought we were going to just lose the house. And also I felt like I needed to hear him say, like, we're going to be okay. Like, I'm going to be okay, Dad. And so that was really important. And then, I'll kind of tie up the story. Things turned out fine. I got another job. I always worked after that. I worked hard. But again, I always kept it in balance. My number one priority was my family. And that's one thing I have absolutely no regrets about. But, here's the takeaway, which is, you never know when one of those moments are going to come up that your kids are going to remember forever. You don't know. You can't plan those. So you've got to spend the time with your kids. And, when there's an opportunity to do something different off the beaten path, something fun, don't let that advantage go out the window, because the time is short. The time when your kids are growing up is very short. So anyway, that's it for today, and hope to see you next time.